A very good morning, and you're welcome to today's Signpost webinar. We hope you're keeping safe and well, and I'm sure many of you made it along to the ploughing championships this week. Really fantastic to see and feel the buzz around the place once again after such a long time. Huge interest in all sorts of organics and sustainability, obviously front and center of a lot of activities at the ploughing, so it was great to see that. The Signpost Series, as you know, is brought to you by Teagasc Connected in association with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, the National Rural Network and Food Drink Ireland SkillNet. And today we're going to be talking about farmers' attitudes to results-based agri-environmental schemes. And for those of you who aren't familiar with them, results-based schemes, they usually involve payments to farmers for delivering results for measures that support biodiversity and other environmental benefits. And we're delighted to be joined by Professor Thia Hennessy, who's head of the School of Business in UCC, and Dr. Tracy Bradfield, who's a lecturer in economics in UCC. Good morning, Thia and Tracy. You're very welcome.
Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
And of course, we have Pat is going to be helping us with questions afterwards. So do send us your questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. But Thia, maybe you could start with you just to give us a little bit of background on the work that you do. You're no stranger to Athenry, where
Yes.
I know you worked with us in Teagasc for many years. But maybe you could tell us about the work that you're doing.
That's right, Mark. Thanks very much for the introduction. I'm with UCC now. I'm head of the School of Business there, but I'm an agricultural economist originally. So the type of research I do is looking at the impact of policy on the viability of farming, and that can be environmental policy or economic policy or market trends or whatever. I'm with UCC 6 years now, but as you said, I was with Teagasc before that. I won't say how many years because it'll age me. But when I was in Teagasc, I was in the economic research program, and I was heading up the National Farm Survey. So many very enjoyable years in Teagasc and doing, similar work still now in UCC.
And still good connection still with Teagasc. And Tracy, you're working in the economics department. Maybe could you tell us a little bit about your own background?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So my name is Tracy Bradfield. I'm currently lecturing in economics in UCC. That includes some agricultural economics modules as well. So I have quite a similar interest really to Thia, so in terms of farm performance, farm sustainability. Like the results I present today as kind of my last year of work. And before that, I researched agricultural land markets with Teagasc as a PhD student. So I've worked heavily with the National Farm Survey as well.
So this is a really pertinent topic. The Department of Agriculture is about to launch the new Acres agri-environmental scheme, which does have strong elements of results-based schemes in it. So it's great to see that those pilots are actually the learnings from those pilots that I'm sure you'll be referring to have been taken on by the department, and ultimately it's about having impact on the ground, because that's obviously the European taxpayer is looking at value for money, and results-based schemes, I understand, are an effective way of achieving that. So I understand, Thia, you're going to start us off with the first part of the presentation, and we will then hear from Tracy, and we'll have some questions afterwards. So Thia, we'll hand over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Mark. And I have some slides, so I'll just share my screen here now. Thank you. So Mark, you might let me know if you can see that, so I know everybody.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great. Thanks very much. Okay, so what Tracy and I would like to do today is share some results with you of a European project that we've been working on for the last number of years. So the format of the event today is I'm going to cover the first part of the presentation, which is really to give you a background to this project and tell you what it's about, and tell you what we mean by innovative contract-based programs. And then I'll hand over to Tracy, who's going to talk about some of the results on the survey we've conducted on this in Ireland and across Europe. And we'll finish up then with some questions with yourselves and some feedback on what you've heard, which would be really useful for us as well to further our own research. Okay, so the project that we've been working on over the last number of years has been funded through the European Commission, the Horizon 2020 programme. There are 24 partners across 13 countries, and UCC are the partner in Ireland. And the project is called Console. And typically with these projects, the project name is an acronym of something that's much longer. So you can see the very long title here, which is really around contract solutions for effective and lasting delivery of agri-environmental public goods. And I'm going to talk about what we mean by all of those kind of concepts in there now in the next couple of slides. But really the overall objective of this project has been to look at how agri-environmental schemes can be designed more effectively to deliver climate public goods by the European Commission. So it's really about providing information to the Commission on policy design. So what do we mean by agri-environmental public goods? I mean, as people with an interest in the agri-environment, by the very fact that you're on this call, all of these issues will be well understood to you. But when we talk about public goods, we talk about a good that is produced but cannot be sold on the market, because the use of that good can't be restricted, and therefore a price cannot be set on it. And therefore, there's no incentive for people to produce such goods, and often the government steps in to support them. So most of the examples of public goods we have in economics textbooks anyway are drawn from the agricultural sector. So we talk about nice landscape, we talk about protecting stone walls, we talk about maintaining water quality. Everybody in society benefits from all of these things, but we don't pay directly for them. And so the government steps in to ensure that they are delivered. So within this project, when we talk about agri-environmental climate public goods, we're talking about a whole range of issues. Although climate is in the title, it's not just about greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprint related issues. It's also about biodiversity, water quality, soil quality, and general rural viability. So that's what we mean by public goods in the context of this project. And I suppose what we're doing then is looking at how effectively government can step in to ensure that these goods are delivered, bearing in mind that consumers don't pay directly for them. And if we look back over history within the EU, we see that the approach of government, or the European Commission, over many decades has been to fund practice-based type approaches. So if we think of the likes of the REPS scheme going back to the 90s, which would be the very earliest form of these schemes, farmers were paid on the basis of what they did. So if they reduced their nitrogen application, if they maintained hedgerows, and so forth. And the payment was linked to the practice that was undertaken. It wasn't linked in any way to the output. And I suppose over the years, reviews of these types of studies have, or of this type of approach, the traditional approach, has found that because they've operated on a national level and because they aren't linked to specific public goods, that they tend to be poorly targeted. So they haven't delivered the desired results. And I suppose a European Court of Auditors assessment of these programs over many decades have concluded that despite the significant investment by taxpayers in them, there's still a decline in biodiversity and water quality. So that leads us to ask the question, how can we design these programs better? And over the last couple of years, we've seen an increasing emphasis on outcome-based or contract-based programs, where essentially the payment to the farmer isn't based on the practice undertaken, but it's based on the quality and the quantity of the output. So these programs are seen to be much more targeted, effective, and better value for money. And we've seen an increase in them right across Europe through things like the EU LIFE programme and the European Innovation Programme, and now increasingly through the new CAP as well. And I suppose what we found is that these programs can be difficult to implement, they can be costly, and they can be difficult to implement on a very widespread basis. So the purpose really of this project was to look at how these projects have been implemented to date across Europe, and to make some recommendations about how they could be expanded in the new CAP and more generally in policy. So what we have done in the project is we've looked at 58 case studies right across Europe, and 4 outside of Europe, of these types of schemes that have run. And as I said, they're usually on a much smaller scale, and we're looking at them in this instance to identify the success factors to be able to inform how you could implement these types of programs in a more widespread way, scale them up effectively. So as part of the project, then we did these case studies, and then after that we assessed farmers' willingness to participate in the different types of programs, with a view to developing a design guide for these types of contracts going forward. So we're just at that stage of developing the design guide at the moment. So what we're going to focus on today is, first of all, I'm going to talk about some of the case studies, and the different types of contract-based programs. And then I'm going to hand over to Tracy to talk about the results of the farm survey. So there are a number of different types of contract-based payments. There are 4 of them on the screen here, and they're the 4 that we focused on: results-based, collective, value chain, and land tenure. And what I'm going to do now is explain how each of those work and give you an example of how they've been implemented in Europe, because as we move on to Tracy's part of the presentation, it's very much about looking at farmers' views about the different types of programs. So looking first of all at the results-based contract solution, this is probably the one that we're most familiar with. The way it operates is that it targets a specific public good. So that could be biodiversity, it could be reducing the carbon footprint, it could be water quality. And measures and indicators are put in place to judge the status of those goods at the start of the program and again at the end of the program. So the idea is that farmers participate in this program. They undertake certain measures which should improve the provision of that public good, and then they get a payment based on the quality of the improvement, not based on the practices undertaken. So we looked at case studies of these types of programs right across Europe, and there are quite a number. It's probably the most common type of outcome-based payments, and we looked at a number in Ireland. So I'm just going to talk about probably the most well-known project in Ireland from a results-based perspective, certainly the longest running one. And this is the one we presented as one of the case studies in Ireland. And there was really a lot of interest in this across Europe because of its longevity and because of the huge passion that Brendan Dunford brings to this project over many years. So you'll probably all be familiar with the Burn Life project. And I suppose why it falls into this category is because farmers participate in this project. They undertake to improve a certain farm practice or a public good, and then they're paid on the basis of the results. So some of the types of things that farmers undertook was the removal of scrub, to move away from the use of silage, to use more appropriate and traditional pasture-based systems that are more appropriate for the sensitive flora and fauna of the burn, the restoration of traditional stone walls. And I suppose there were indicators linked to all of these activities. They were measured before and after, and the farmers' payments were very much dependent on what was delivered. And I suppose across Europe, this is seen to be one of the very successful examples of how contract-based, outcome-based payments can be run. And also what we can learn from a project like this in terms of scaling it up. Okay, so that's probably the one people are most familiar with, but other types of programs then are more common across Europe. So the next one is, it's kind of a similar approach, but it's on collective implementation. So the idea here is that for some public goods to really improve their delivery, you need to do it on a regional basis. So maybe biodiversity, water quality, if 1 or 2 farms participate, but others that are feeding into the same water stream or enabling a particular farm don't participate, you won't get the same quality. So the idea of collective action is that in a particular region, a group of farmers need to come together. They can be coordinated by an intermediary. Again, they're coming together to improve the delivery of a specific public good. Again, there's prescribed management, but there's also measurements of the outcome, and the funding is based on the quality of the outcome. So we couldn't find any specific case study in Ireland that is similar to this. Yes, the burn is in a region, but I think with collective implementation, all of the neighbouring farms within a specific area need to come together to work on it. So the example here is from France, and it is where 140 farmers located in a particular region came together and managed their, I suppose, crop rotations and the types of crops that were being planted, and they did that specifically to protect the habitat for this very rare type of hamster. And I suppose this was one of the examples we looked at across Europe that had worked quite successfully, and the payment then was based on the number of hamster burrows that were found in the particular region. So by planting particular crops and rotating them in a certain way, they were making the land, I suppose, a friendlier place for these hamsters to live. So the next type of contract we looked at was value chain contract solutions. And I suppose here it's a similar concept that farmers set out to improve the delivery of a particular public good, but that they're rewarded for doing that through the value chain. And what do we mean by that? We mean that the consumer of the final product is actually paying a price premium for it. So this is an example where the market is working rather than the government to deliver this product. So I think this is a really interesting one, and it would be a very nice program to be able to scale up, maybe a little bit more difficult in Ireland where we export most of our products, but it was one that we see is much more common across Europe where there are shorter supply chains. And by that, I mean that a lot of the product is sold locally, and it's maybe easier for the consumers to connect with it and pay a higher price. The closest example we found in Ireland was we did a case study on the Carbery Greener dairy farms. And I know that many of you will be familiar with this, where the 62 farmers supplying Carbery Co-op came together to undertake a vast array of measures to undergo education programs. I know many of them studied in UCC as part of this program, with the overall, I suppose, ambition to reduce the carbon footprint of the products they produce to deliver additional public goods through biodiversity and water quality. And I suppose all of this was funded through the co-op. Now, if there's anybody on the line and they can attest to the fact that this was actually resulted in delivering a higher price back through the value chain, I mean, that would be the ultimate success factor. But I think this is probably the closest that we have to an agri-environmental outcome-based program that's operated through the value chain that involves industry. So finally, the last type of contract we looked at then is one that wouldn't be common in Ireland at all, and it's a land tenure-based one, and it is where like a large area of land is rented for the specific purpose of delivering a public good. So just looking, it might be easier to explain it with the example. Just looking at this example here in Bulgaria, where the EU Life project funded the Protection of Birds Society to work with farmers to lease out over 600 hectares of land, so really, really large area of land. And by leasing it out, then the farmers still had access to the land to a certain extent. They could use it for grazing, but they did have to undertake special environmental practices to protect that area for natural habitats. And they received then the payment from the society rather than receiving a payment from the state in terms of the outcome-based solution. So a different type of model again. So I suppose the purpose really of showing you all of these different types of case studies is that they all have their own particular strengths and opportunities. Some of them might be very culturally sensitive and might work in certain countries and not in Ireland. And I suppose we looked at some of those strengths and opportunities, and many of them link to how they're funded, how the payment is delivered, how the outcome is measured, and all of that. So common issues really across lots of them. So I suppose at this stage, I'm handing over to Tracy, and she's really going to talk then about how we explored farmers' attitudes to these different types of approaches to delivering public goods. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Tracy now. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Thia. Okay, so hopefully you can all see this is section part 2 of our presentation. So really what I'm looking at here is the data we've collected over the last year or so. So across the EU, we've surveyed about 2,000 farmers, and I've portrayed the data now, the Irish data beside our European counterparts. So we asked farmers questions such as, do you agree that, let's say, a results-based contract is easy to understand? And this is what's outlined in my first slide. So nearly 70% of farmers in Ireland agreed that a results-based contract was easy to understand. Now, this can be attributed to the fact that results-based contracts are relatively common in Ireland compared to the other contract types. And our results in Ireland were quite similar to those of our European counterparts. And the type of contract that I suppose is the least easy to understand seems to be the collective agreement. These are complex. Of course, they involve a lot of farmers working together and negotiating how they'll work together and how payments will be divided. So they can be quite complex. In terms then of value chain and land tenure contracts, about 40 to 50% of farmers in Ireland agree that these are understandable. And we're slightly falling behind European counterparts in terms of understanding the broad range of agri-environmental contracts that are available. We also asked farmers if they agree that the particular contracts are applicable to their farm. And again, results-based contracts scored highly. So 75% of farmers in Ireland feel that this type of contract would be applicable to their farm, which is higher than other European countries. Again, collective contracts score quite lowly, and not many farmers believe that this type of contract would be applicable to them either in Ireland or in other European countries. Approximately 50% of farmers in Ireland feel that value chain contracts would be applicable to their farm, so they are looking at them quite favourably, and that's slightly below the opinion in other European countries where this type of contract is much more prevalent. In terms then of land tenure, I suppose this is interesting in that in Ireland we don't have a particularly high level of land rental. Only 19% of agricultural land is rented in here, as opposed to the European average of 54%. So I suppose it's hard in some cases to see how this might be applicable when we don't have a history of land rental, but it is increasing, and there is optimism in that. Nearly 40% of farmers feel that this type of contract could be applicable to them. Understandability and applicability then seem to feed into economic benefits. So we asked farmers, do they agree that these type of contracts would be economically beneficial for them? So again, results-based contracts are favouring very well. 71% of farmers feel that this would be economically beneficial for them, which is much higher than the European figure. Again, collective seems to be, there's low levels of understandability, low levels of applicability, and also economic benefits are perceived to be low here again. In terms of value chain and land tenure, again, between around the 40 to 50% of farmers in Ireland feel that that would be economically beneficial for them. I suppose in terms of looking at these results as an overall, farmers in Ireland do perceive the economic benefits of agro-environmental contracts to be high across the 4 contract types, much higher than the European results. So we delved into this a little bit further. So we ran some statistical analysis to see, what characteristics of a farm are encouraging farmers to feel that results-based contracts in particular would be economically beneficial for them. So we find that younger farmers are more likely to perceive results-based contracts to be economically beneficial. I suppose they're susceptible to, the media promoting these type of contracts, education, and these are all factors that are encouraging them to see the economic benefits. Farmers with a high percentage of rented land also feel that these type of contracts would be beneficial for them. And those that have not previously used results-based contracts are very optimistic about the economic benefits that these type of contracts could provide for them. So just to kind of outline the other factors we did look at and the factors that don't increase the probability of perceiving these contracts to be economically beneficial. So farming system had no influence, farm size, which I thought was quite surprising, agricultural training, which in general is very high anyway across the board, and farm to total income. So these 4 factors didn't influence the perceived economic benefits of the results-based design of agri-environmental contracts. So overall, there is very high levels of understanding, applicability, and perceived economic benefits of results-based contracts. And similar to European counterparts, collective contracts are generally scoring low. It seems to be a low understanding, a low feeling that they'll be applicable to farms here in Ireland, and generally the economic benefits are perceived to be low. And Irish farmers agree with the economic benefits of results-based contracts. And when we've spoken to farmers, we found out that farmers like to work with their own autonomy and to be independent, and that would also signal why the collective contracts wouldn't be as attractive. So in a previous event we held not long, just before Christmas of last year, we asked farmers and actually stakeholders, so we had industry representatives and researchers who were also asked what factors would increase the adoption of results-based contracts here in Ireland. So we gave the participants, I think, over 20 options, and they came from a broad range of themes. So we had political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors that may influence the adoption of results-based contracts. So in terms of political stuff like paperwork, support from the government, in terms of economic stuff like remuneration for efforts made, financial risk, a secure supply chain was also important. Then from social side, we had farmers' acceptance, society's acceptance, cooperation, and technology then, of course, was things like having accurate measures and also technologies to carry out environmental practices. Legal then revolved around kind of the design of the contract and how simple it would be. And environmental then, of course, looked at the results and would it be a short-term result or a long-term result that might be affecting the importance here. So in terms of the results then, what is most important to encourage farmers to adopt results-based contracts? There was 3 top results. So the first one was that appropriate remuneration is important for increasing participation. So 74% of farmers rated this as very high, 21% said it was medium importance, and 4% low. The second then was simplicity and understandability of the contract. 67% rated as high, 33% medium. And then the third most important factor to encouraging results-based contracts is defining suitable monitoring indicators. So 63% rated as high, 26% medium, and 11% rated this of low importance to encouraging results-based contracts. So really throughout the session, I hope we've provided a good background on the type of contracts that are available. Results-based contracts at the moment are the most prevalent. And I suppose I'd like to get your thoughts on, should there be more programs that are based on outcomes, and if so, how should they be designed? So thank you very much for your time, and I'd love to hear some feedback that you may have.
Thanks, Tracy and Thia. And I think they're two very good questions to ask our audience today. So please, if you could maybe use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we could capture some of your thoughts there on those two questions. Maybe Tracy, if you could just remind us of those two questions.
Okay, so generally I'm looking for feedback. So do you think, any caller on the line, would they think that there should be a greater emphasis on outcome-based contracts, whether it be results-based, whether it be collective action, value chain, or tenure-based contracts? And if so, how should they be designed? So what we learned from previous efforts, and how can we improve going into the future in terms of our contract designs?
Yeah, because I mean, there is a lot of experience, as you said, in the country with results-based schemes. And I see that Brendan Dunford is viewing this morning, one of the pioneers of results-based scheme there in the Burren, a great example of what can be achieved in a targeted way. And I guess we also see in the new Acres program, there are those cooperative measures in place to chase after kind of geographically specific issues. So it is great to see that those learnings are being incorporated into policy. Just in terms of the effort that's required to achieve these targeted results, there is quite an overhead when it comes to delivering a more targeted scheme. I think that would that be fair to say, Tracy?
It would be, and from the people I've spoken to that are actively involved in these programs, there are concerns around funding. You know, they're for a short period, they like to see them into the future. And the reasons that if there is long-term funding, it's more encouraging for people to get involved in these programs, as well for, of course, the logistics side as well, and that farmers are supported for a longer period of time, of course.
Mm-hmm. Thia, you spoke about the value chain based contracts, and that I know there's been a lot of studies done around that willingness to pay for additional environmental or public benefits. Where is that at the moment in terms of, you know, I know it's you can't make a generalism about people's willingness to pay, but even in Ireland here, I know there have been some studies on that area.
Yeah. So and I know I was looking at the Q&A there, Mark, and I know that somebody provided clarification on the Carberry example as well, that they felt there wasn't a specific price premium for it, and I suppose that's what I suspected, but didn't want to make that statement. It's tricky. I suppose it's tricky in Ireland, first of all, because we export so much of what we produce, and so much of it is a commodity type product. So if you're producing milk and it's going into milk powder, and that's ultimately going into a product that's being produced for the North African market, you know, it is difficult to get a price premium for that. So it's certainly not a panacea and a large scale solution for everything, but it could be a targeted approach, you know. So we do see things like you know, producer groups coming together, and by positioning and promoting their product, that they can get a price premium. I suppose the one thing I would say is that the way the political and economic environment is at the moment, it's probably not the scheme you would be pursuing because of the whole cost of living crisis. We had a conference in UCC earlier in the year, and we had the CEOs of Musgrave and Tesco there, and they just talked about, I suppose, the relentless pressure that retailers are under from both sides of the supply chain to pay producers a decent price, but to try to keep food price inflation down. And especially at the moment, that's a really serious issue. So, like in theory, this is a scheme that could work for a targeted niche kind of product, but because of the type of production we have in Ireland, I couldn't see it being a large scale solution, really.
Yeah, that issue came up. I was chairing a session at the ploughing during the week with a group of farmers the Dingle Peninsula, who are looking at ways of responding to the climate challenge. And of course, adding value to their product was one of the options being looked at. But of course, for the rest, or the vast majority of product produced in this country, it's exported to commodity markets, which is that there lies in the challenge to how can we achieve that. Pat, I don't know if you're still with us. We do have quite a number of questions coming through, so we'll come to those in a second. And Pat, you have a lot of experience with these particular schemes as well, because you're head of the Environment Knowledge Transfer program in Teagasc, and have been working very closely with schemes. I mean, could I just ask you what your observations on this study are?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to start seeing the attitudes of farmers coming back. It's one of the, I suppose, one of the factors that we wouldn't have seen. We will have seen, I suppose, that they're where they're effectively put together, that they are very effective, and our impression is that farmers like them when they get used to them, that they're a little bit nervous of them at the beginning, and I suppose we have the advantage here, and this has been reflected in the questions, that maybe the example of the Burren and its success in an Irish context has helped I suppose the perception of results based in the Irish context, and there's a couple of questions in relation to that about the degree to which that has been an impact. But I think farmers are beginning to realize more that if we're going to sustain payments into the future, there has to be a demonstration of a benefit and a positive outcome, and that to achieve that, that an element of looking at the quality of those outcomes, the improvements that are being driven, is going to be essential for that to happen in the future.
Mm. Tracy, could I just ask, in relation to this contracts that you observed in other countries, were there any particularly innovative measures that you saw in place there that that tried to achieve that market, or creating that market for environmental products or public goods? I mean, that is the holy grail, isn't it, when it comes to environmental economics, is trying to place a value on these activities, or the goods that are being produced by farmers.
Yeah, definitely. So I suppose the biggest difference between Ireland and our European counterparts is, in Ireland, the agri-environmental contracts are mainly results-based. In particularly, say, the Netherlands, for one example, they have much broader selection. So value chain contracts are actively in place. They're favoured quite positively. Same with collective agreements. I suppose the results I show kind of was a bit negative maybe on collective agreements, and that the understandability, acceptability, and our perceived economic benefits were quite low. But say in the Netherlands, it's much, much higher. They have these contracts in place. They're quite in favour of them, and they've been successful. And of course, with land tenure as well, they're much more active. So it is interesting to see. Like, my opinion from people I've spoken to is that in Ireland we do have a strong preference to kind of work maybe independently. And of course, look, I've spoken as well about land rental being lower in Ireland. There's just, I suppose, a different mindset maybe in other parts of Europe, where with larger farms, they're used to working collectively, they're used to working with corporations. Industry has put a premium on some of the prices of the products. So it's much broader, I suppose, in terms of the perspective in some of the European countries. But of course, the agricultural landscape is different in every country, so that's what's driving that. But it is great to see projects here that have been very successful, and they're a great example for what we can do, and I suppose to implement them across the country now is the next task, which will be fantastic.
And Thia, without straying too far away from the subject here, but we do see quite a shift occurring with the co-ops who are buying products now. Previously, there wasn't a willingness to pay a levy or premium for products that were produced in a particularly environmentally friendly way. That's now changing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that consumers and the customers of co-ops, who are like the infant milk manufacturers and all of these other also very big companies, are demanding better environmental standards and evidence of same. But I suppose it's questionable whether they're paying for it. Is it just being expected at the market price now? Or are they saying if you can show that your carbon footprint is below a certain level, that you can prove something about biodiversity, we'll pay you a higher price? I think just listening to industry leaders talking, it's more of the former, that it's just that you're expected to do it to stay in business, rather than being rewarded a higher price for it. And I mean, that becomes the difficult part of it when we talk about public goods, who pays to deliver them. And I suppose in the current environment, there is still going to be a very big role for government to pay for them, because it doesn't seem like the market will step up.
And has there been any discussion, Thia, in any of the fora that you've been involved in around the carbon levy on food, or where let's say beef produced in Ireland versus being produced in another country is differentiated through some form of a levy?
Not particularly, I suppose. I mean, we have our own national targets in Ireland around greenhouse gas emissions, which we need to meet in the national environment, regardless, I suppose, of what's happening on the market more generally. Like, are you talking about, say, a kind of a carbon tax? I suppose that was something that came up. It came up at the Citizens' Assembly a number of years back. This proposal that certain products would be taxed in the way that we have a sugar tax. But I mean, I think it's out there as a concept. I haven't seen it being developed in any way in particular, and I don't know how popular it would be, let's put it that way, or acceptable.
It could, you wouldn't know the unintended consequences from a measure like that. Pat, lots of really good questions coming through there.
Yeah, and I suppose a couple coming in about the breakdown, or the farmer survey and the farmers who were surveyed. Were they a random group of farmers? Were they people? Was there a significant number of who had been exposed to agri-environmental schemes, and in particular results-based schemes? What was the nature of that breakdown? I think it's important in interpreting the results as well.
Okay, yeah, so it was a random sample, and then there was a mix, and I can't think of some of my head, the mix between people that had previously used a contract. I think predominantly was people that hadn't previously used such a contract, and it was looking then at their attitudes. But there was a broad selection, like it was across a range of farming systems, across farm sizes and different regions in Ireland as well.
Okay, just I suppose one of the questions that's coming in terms of farmers' openness to the use of results-based is the risk of a zero payment, or the risk of a very low payment. To what extent was that expressed by farmers in conversation, or is it something that they're not that concerned about?
Yeah, that's something actually we could explore a bit more. I think that's kind of my concern about the collective contracts, why the percentage of farmers that agree they're applicable to their farm or they'd be economically beneficial is quite low. I think there might be concerns about that in terms of getting collective agreements for, say, farmers in an area, and then that their payments are susceptible to everyone working together. So I think that's the concern with that type of contract in particular, that it might be perceived as being more high risk compared to, say, a results-based contract, where you're much more independent.
I've a comment from Ciara Donovan, who was involved in the Greener Dairy program with Carberry, and she's making the point that, to her knowledge, that suppliers didn't receive a higher payment for their milk in that, and that the benefit came solely from the marketplace. But I suppose there's two questions that come out of that. I suppose historically, unless I'm mistaken, I think Carberry is one of the higher paying co-ops. So there's an element to which, if we're sustainable and showing sustainability, that's reflected in price. But there's also something, Thia, that I might refer to you, and that is, I suppose, the advent and the continued development of sustainability bonuses within the dairy co-ops, and how does that fit in with, I suppose, the idea of the value chain payment? Is that in effect a value chain payment scheme, or is it something quite different?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it is, and it's loosest definition of the scheme. And if you think of the dairy quality assurance scheme run through Board BIA, which I think every farmer is a member of now, that is also a form of the value chain scheme. But I suppose when it isn't linked to a specific premium, and linked to a specific set of activities. It's really, I suppose, a very kind of aggregate view of it. I think when we talked about it in this project, we talked about much more defined measures, much more defined outcomes being targeted, you know, at a specific scale rather than a kind of a national program like that. And while you know, the national level programs, you might say, don't deliver a specific premium per se, the argument that some would make is that maybe the milk price would be lower if we weren't doing this, because, you know, the Danones and the different big companies that are buying Irish product would buy it elsewhere if we weren't as sustainable as we are.
Yeah, and one of the other questions coming in relates to the kind of amount of money that needs to go to the oversight of such projects relative to the more traditional type. Is it generally higher, or is it seen as being, from a farmer's perspective, as a problem with the schemes?
Like, there's no doubt about it, administratively, they're much more challenging, and there's a reason why we started with the likes of REPS. It was much more easy to implement. When we look at some of the case studies, I mean, you have ecologists employed, you have people go out measuring specific things on farms. You're talking there about a project in France where you're counting the number of hamster burrows. I mean, this is a major barrier to implementing these types of programs on a wide scale. And that's why I think anything that is implemented on a wide scale will have to be simplified. And I think they're the results that are coming out of Tracy's analysis as well, that to do this on a bigger scale, there has to be some simplification in terms of the measurement of the outcomes because of the cost of administering them otherwise, you know.
I think
they're come out of the Burn. Sorry, Mark, I was just going to say this would have all come out of Brendan's different publications coming out of the Burn project as well, you know.
I think the message also was that there are trade-offs here as well. That, I mean, if we are to have impact with these schemes, they need to be, you know, well targeted, and that level of support needs to be in place to guide farmers, and for farmers to learn from each other as well, and to get that level of collaboration going as well. So we have another question there in relation to the water quality. Which model do you think would work best for water quality? Is maybe Tracy, from your experience, is there a particular model that is better linked to different environmental goods?
Yeah, I think so. For water quality, the collective action, I think, would be the best, in terms of, obviously, water covers a wide area, so we need a buy-in from a group of farmers really in the vicinity. In terms then of, actually, some additional data now I didn't present today, and kind of the perceived benefits for each public goods, and then the strong favour, I suppose, for results-based contracts for biodiversity. That's the favoured one for that. I suppose it could be, I suppose, compared to water, it's a bit more localized, and that farmers have a bit more control individually. In terms of other public goods, then carbon storage, across the range of contracts, really, that can be improved through the 4 types. But definitely for water, I would say collective.
Yeah, that would make sense. That would make sense. And I mean, that is the basis of the ASAP program that Teagasc is working with farmers and industry. It's very much a collective approach in targeting particular water bodies.
Yeah, I suppose just a question there in relation to the outcomes of the project, and one of them, I'm not sure if it's part of your outcomes, is the design guide for agri-environmental schemes. Is that part of the output? And I know the person who's looking for it is in the process of designing a results-based scheme at the moment for water quality. So
yeah, so I suppose it's part of the overall final output of the project that's being led by the Italian team. So the work we're doing here in Ireland is feeding into that, and I'm not sure what the timeline is on that. The project is due to finish this year, so I'm sure that output will be coming in the next couple of months. So if whoever's on the line wants to email us, we can share it. It'll be in the public domain once it's finished, you know. But I suppose it's a set of recommendations to the Commission really on our findings in terms of trying to scale up these types of programs.
A question there in relation to whether there's something particularly innovative at a European level that you saw that you think could be transferable to Ireland.
Yeah, I suppose like the case studies, we picked a sample of them there, and that's fairly representative of them. What I would say is that when we look at the case studies, I think they're very culturally specific. Like if we look at Austria, they have a lot of value-based, value chain-based examples there, but like that, they're one of the highest consumers of organic products in the world. And there, you know, there's probably, it's a wealthy country and it's probably an easier market to deliver that kind of program. We looked at the collective action program. We saw a lot of examples of that from Eastern Europe. And I suppose that wouldn't surprise you then in terms of the history of collective farming that we've come through there. So like what we picked was a sample of different, the 58 different case studies. They're all available online. We did a short fact sheet on each one of them that has the same template. So it's quite easy to flip through them. But what I would say is, like, some of them look very innovative, but you'd wonder how they transfer to Ireland, because I do think they are kind of culturally specific. And that was the value of doing a project like this all over Europe. And I think what it reinforces for the Commission is, you know, they talk about this principle of subsidiarity, allowing countries to set their own policies to a certain extent. And I think that reinforces this concept, because certainly what might work in Austria or Bulgaria wouldn't necessarily work here. So these programs do need to be, you know, co-developed within a country with the farmers to really ensure their success.
There's a couple of questions in relation to the land tenure approach and just how that works. I think people are trying to get their heads around where the incentive is within that, and how it approaches a series of environmental or collective objectives.
So as the example there was, like, it's really where a third party comes in and has a rental agreement with a large number of farmers in a particular area. The farmers still have access to the land, but by taking the rent from the third party, they're agreeing to a certain set of measures. So it's almost like it's like a collective action, I suppose, except there's an intermediary there. And they maybe don't have the same production rights or land rights than they would have under the collective action. So it's kind of quite a specific one. Again, you know, you would see this in Australia and in North America, and maybe areas where there are really large tracts of land where, you know, societies or charities or government bodies would come in and they'd rent very large areas of land to prevent land abandonment and that kind of thing. So again, it's the one maybe that we're not as familiar with in Ireland. I don't know, Tracy, if you want to add anything to that in terms of farmers' views when you discussed it with them.
Yeah, so in terms of understandability, it was quite low. About 40% of farmers in Ireland understand that system of the ones we surveyed. Applicability, again, to the farmers was quite low. Less than half would say, or even lower. I think about 30% of farmers would feel it would be applicable to their farm. And of course, the big obstacle there is, can a farmer get into that agreement? Can they find someone to rent them land, or are they willing to rent out land? So that, I suppose, is the major obstacle. And one thing for it to be understandable and applicable, but can they actually feasibly engage in that type of contract? And then in terms of the economic benefits, those figures are quite good. About 40% of farmers felt it could be something that would be economically beneficial for them. But definitely the obstacle of the land market, I suppose, is where I think the biggest concern is, can farmers access land to engage in this contract?
And I suppose as you talk, Tracy, I'm reminded of your own PhD research, where you looked at how successful all the tax incentives for long-term land leasing have been in Ireland. And I suppose, you know, you can talk yourself about the findings in terms of the strong sentiment in Ireland and kind of reluctance to enter long-term leasing. Do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, so in Ireland, a farmer that rents out their land can get up to €40,000 tax-free each year. That has increased. Now that has to be on a long-term lease. We're talking about 15 years or more for that particular level of tax relief. It has encouraged land rental a bit, I suppose, you know, over the last decade or so. Well, this tax incentive was increased in 2015. So particularly in the last few years, it has increased. But we're lagging behind other European countries, like parts of Eastern Europe, particularly Slovakia. 89% of land is rented. In Ireland, it's 19%. And the European average then is 54%. So our land market isn't that active, and we think about land sales as well. You know, less than 1% of land is sold each year. So being able to negotiate those kind of contracts now is going to be difficult if there isn't kind of an open market for, you know, ease in which we can rent in and rent out land, particularly on a long-term lease. If a farmer is going to engage in an agri-environmental scheme that's going to run for 2 or 3 years, they need to have that land for that period. So it's going to involve a step away from con-acre agreements, which is still the predominant one.
I know, talking to some people, they would feel that the agri-environmental schemes are locking up land. That, you know, I know there's a lot of let's say dairy farmers out there who would like to get greater access to land, and would feel that these agri-environmental schemes are blocking that access. Did that come up through any of your work?
Yeah, access to land, you know, is, I suppose, the predominant topic of my PhD, and attachment is what features through. People want to, of course, pass on land to the next generation, and they'll, you know, keep it for that reason, of course. So that does limit the market in terms of sales. You know, I think land rental will become more active, but yeah, again, if there's many people demanding it, of course, that is an obstacle, and dairy farmers, you know, will want more, of course.
Just in the context of, we know that a lot of these schemes, you know, we've had CAP for many, many years now, and these schemes in the last 30 or so years, a lot of the environmental indicators are still not going in the right direction. And there's a comment here, which I think is appropriate here. It says the administrative cost of these results-based projects cannot be taken in isolation, as all agri-environmental schemes should have a monitoring element to ensure value for taxpayers' money. It's far cheaper to administer schemes that work like results-based than pay for unsupported or unmonitored schemes that fail to deliver. Would you agree with that comment?
Sorry, could you summarize that maybe?
So basically, you know, having targeted, results-based schemes, they're ultimately better value for money for the taxpayer, because the results you're getting higher impact effectively.
Yeah, they're easier to measure, I suppose. Like I did some statistical analysis on, sorry, actually it was a poll. It was the last results I presented. So I asked stakeholders, so whether they're farmers, industry, or researchers, what they think is most important for encouraging results-based contracts, or actually all agri-environmental schemes, and they said simple indicators. So I think that's where the results-based contracts are winning. This easy to monitor relatively, and they're very clear for farmers as well, as opposed to, say, the value chain contract, where there's a lot of uncertainty. Will the money go from the final consumer back to the producer? In terms of collective contract, will everyone pull together to the same level, and will the payments reflect the level of effort and the results that are coming from each farmer? And then the 10-year contract as well is still, you know, where's that money going to come from? So the results-based contracts are very clear, and that's why they're gaining popularity and, of course, success as well.
I might come in on that as well, Mark, and I think it just relates to another comment that I saw there in the Q&A box, and it's that like the results-based approach is more effective in delivering public goods. And yes, you have to pay for the administration. And as the person has made the point, maybe that's money well spent. But I think, and then you talked about the overall national profile of water quality and greenhouse gas emissions. I think the issue with lots of these programs, whether they're results or practice-based, is the type of farmer who gets into them. And if you have a scheme that's only attracting farmers who are already performing at quite a good environmental standard, and maybe are not very intensive in production, getting into a program and being even better. But if you have a large group of farmers over here who are very intensive and they're not in any program, you're never really going to see major changes in your national indicators around water quality. And I think it's trying to fix that issue is one of the main challenges of these agri-environmental programs. Designing a program that will bring in a large chunk of the population, and even a large chunk making a very small change, is probably better than preaching to the converted who are already in these programs and they're doing even more. I don't know if you get my point there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no,
yeah.
It makes sense. And I guess it's how accessible those schemes are. And also I think the sort of the narrative around these schemes, you know, that you're not seen to be, you know, hanging up your farming by engaging in one of these schemes, that these are some really progressive farmers that are engaged in agri-environmental schemes, and are also involved in, I know there's some fantastic work going on with the Farming for Nature network as well. So there's a lot happening in that space.
I think it's like sorry, Pat.
Yeah, no, you're
I
fine.
think the signpost program, Pat, that you're so involved in yourself, like I think that's just a really effective way of demonstrating that, you know, these initiatives don't have to be for the minority. They can be rolled out on large commercial productive farms and can make an environmental impact, and farms can still generate a very decent income from their farm. Do you know that we're mainstreaming all of these concepts of sustainability rather than them being for a particular cohort of farms? Sorry, Pat.
No, and there's just, I suppose, a comment here about whether farmers are completely motivated by economic benefits, or are there a significant number of farmers who just want to see their local environment improve? And I suppose it raises a question as to whether the involvement in, is there any evidence that the involvement in results-based type approaches increases either motivation or capacity or education of the farmers to deliver more?
I think those results are in a kind of an anecdotal way from looking at the case studies that you see that farmers who become involved in those kind of schemes become extremely enthused. And even when the funding runs out, they continue to deliver the public good because, in fact, you know, they might not have just been doing it for the payment. They might have been doing it for the good for the farm, or for the habitats or biodiversity or whatever it is that's motivated on them, motivating for them. And I suppose it comes back to, why do people get involved in the first place? And that's why I think we need to broaden the type of farmers that are getting involved. And by being part of these programs and seeing the results, and hopefully seeing the environmental results without seeing a major negative impact on the productive capacity of their farm, that's where you'll see real long-term benefits then when the funding does expire.
And I suppose great examples of European innovation projects are taking place across the country that are piloting these measures. So it's a great test bed for future schemes or mainstreaming schemes. And so, you know, obviously it's important that the economic dimension of that is considered when designing or looking at these testing these schemes. We're getting close to, we're pretty much up on time. Pat, did you have a final comment?
No, I think it'll be interesting to see with 20,000 farmers going into cooperation project acres schemes now, which are totally results based. I think there'll be a much bigger database for us to learn the attitudes and to extend our learning. So it'd be nice to see the continuation of the analysis of attitudes and success and failures in this space, because I think we do need to learn quickly about what works and what doesn't work.
Okay, we have to wrap it up there. Tracy and Thia, thank you so much for coming along today to share the results of the Console project. I presume if people want to find out more about that project, Google it, I guess, is probably the
own website. Yeah, I don't know what it is offhand now. It's something like console.eu, but it will come up, and all the case studies are there actually for people who asked questions about different examples across Europe.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. And a special thanks to our audience for the really excellent questions this morning as well, because it is a complex enough area, and but people obviously have a really good grip at this area, because it's a very, judging by the questions coming through. Pat, thanks very much for helping out with questions. And I want to say thanks to Yvonne Maher, who's helping us with our the technical background here, and of course Andy Boland, who's the series producer. Next week we're going to be joined by Ruth Buggy from Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, and Dinny Galvin from the West Kerry Sustainable Energy Community, and we're talking about starting an agricultural sustainable energy community. So do join us for that discussion next Friday at 9:30. But in the meantime, I hope you have and get to enjoy the fine weather, and have a good and safe week. We will see you next Friday. Thanks.